corners of the earth and the far corridors of history. Dateline, World War II. 12 August 1942, Guadalcanal. In the 1 week since their abandonment, the Marines here have nearly completed their first task on the island, the construction of an airfield from which to launch assaults on other islands in the Solomon chain. The job has been complicated by a lack of adequate equipment, harshly limited rations, nightly shelling, and a continuing air war which is more of an annoyance than an actual threat. Henderson Field, named by the men in honor of a Marine flyer killed in the Battle of Midway, is not yet adequate for the large bombers required for a full-scale onslaught against the Japanese. Nonetheless, it can accommodate the handful of Marine fighter planes currently helping protect the ground forces from the Japanese aerial assault. While the American pilots are kept busy fighting off the Japanese, who have a seemingly inexhaustible supply of planes, the engineers on the ground face travails almost as great. The meteorological extremes endemic to the Solomons make keeping the field operational a constant battle. The runway often changes from an impenetrable dust cloud to a veritable swamp in the course of just 1 day. Most frustrating to the Marines on the ground is the endless waiting. The knowledge that the Japanese are out there planning, waiting for just the right moment to attack, leads to a miserable combination of persistent edginess and interminable boredom. The men are left only to walk guard daily and to work on their airfield. By 20 August, Henderson Field is prepared enough to receive its first new planes. A few dozen Dauntless dive bombers and Grumman Wildcats arrive, and the Navy pilots quickly integrate into the Cactus Air Force. The weary Marines welcome the new faces, knowing that the sooner the Japanese planes are held at bay, the sooner they can get on with their job on the ground and get off Guadalcanal. On 21 August, the waiting is over. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki and his men attack in an attempt to retake Henderson Field. Charging headlong into the American positions, the Japanese are cut to pieces by the Marines' well-coordinated machine gun and artillery fire. Although they never breached the defensive perimeter, over 800 Japanese die in a battle lasting only a few hours, leaving only a handful of survivors to retreat. Following the Japanese attack, life for the men on Henderson Field returns to the pattern of annoyance and boredom of the previous weeks. On the evening of 12 September, the 35th Japanese Brigade launches a three-pronged assault on the Marines on Lizard Hill, which overlooks Henderson Field from the north. If Lizard Hill changes hands, both the Japanese and the Americans know that the American hold on the airstrip is as good as lost. Though the Americans hold the line, as the Japanese withdraw, the men know that this was nothing more than a test. The real attack is yet to come, and the men spend the day fortifying their positions. The Japanese attack on 13 September. This time, they focus the bulk of their force on the center of the Marines' line on Lizard Hill. Although the Japanese units attack with bravery and determination, they are uncoordinated and are slaughtered by machine gun and artillery fire. The Marines succeed in holding their line, but at a cost. 59 Marines are dead, over 200 are wounded, and the survivors have begun calling the site of the gruesome battle Bloody Ridge. The victory brings no sense of relief. The Marines, as they have in the previous weeks, return to the business of life on Guadalcanal. They work on the airfield, tighten their defensive positions, and then, as always, wait. August 1942, North Africa. After the stunning British victory at the Battle of El Alamein, the English 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery and the Axis armies under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel have settled into defensive positions only a few thousand yards apart. Separating the two sides is a vast German minefield known as Devil's Garden. Containing more than 500,000 anti-personnel and anti-tank mines, the barrier gives Rommel's forces a temporary sense of security. Although they realize that an offensive by Montgomery is inevitable, the minefield presents him with a difficult obstacle. He will need time to marshal his forces in order to breach it. In the meantime, both forces endure the brutal summer of the North African desert. Although the sweltering heat and the millions of biting flies show no favor to either side, life for the Axis troops is decidedly more miserable than for their British counterparts. A severe lack of fresh water makes bathing a luxury the Axis troops cannot afford. Their own unpleasant aroma, coupled with the stench of the battlefield and human excrement, serve to rob the troops of their appetite. Living in filth, undernourished, and fighting the biting flies, the Axis troops begin to lose weight, becoming easy prey to disease. Even Rommel, the desert fox himself, succumbs. His personal physician, Dr. Horster, reports that the field marshal suffers low blood pressure and dizzy spells and recommends Rommel return to Germany for treatment. By 30 August, Rommel's condition becomes so severe that he reluctantly agrees to leave his Africa Corps to seek medical help. He meets with his officers, giving detailed instructions on what to do in almost any imaginable scenario. On 23 September, Rommel begins his trip home. After a stop in Italy to confer with Mussolini, Rommel continues on to a meeting with Hitler on the 30th. Hitler presents the field marshal with a jewel-encrusted baton and assures him that everything will be done to guarantee an Axis victory in North Africa. On 3 October, Rommel, under pressure from Goebbels, holds a press conference with international correspondents. He reads a prepared speech declaring that Axis troops, 50 miles from Alexandria and Cairo, have the door to Egypt in their hands, and guarantees that after coming so far, they will not be denied their prize. Whether or not Rommel can live up to that promise may well be decided in his absence. British intelligence knows he is no longer in North Africa. The question now is, will Montgomery take this opportunity to attack while facing a lesser general, or will he wait until he has built his forces and risk confrontation with a rejuvenated desert fox? 12 September 1942, the South Atlantic. While patrolling some 250 miles northeast of Ascension Island, the captain of German U-Boat 156 spots the silhouette of a ship which is quickly identified as the British ocean liner Laconia. The 20,000-ton Laconia, formerly an armed merchant cruiser but now operating as a troop transport, is deemed a legitimate target. In short order, U-156 fires a torpedo at the unsuspecting vessel. What the sub's captain and crew do not realize is that the ship is carrying Italian soldiers captured in North Africa to prisoner of war camps in Canada. Also among the passengers are British women and children. The Laconia is only one of a staggering number of casualties in the battle between the German U-boats and the Allied naval forces. The seas that link the factories of America to the battlefields of Europe and North Africa have become the scene of a deadly cat-and-mouse game, one in which the playing field seems to pitch and roll, much like the ocean itself, favoring one side and then the other. In the early part of the war, supplies carried from America to England often traveled in individual ships without escort. For the U-boats, these lone, unarmed travelers were fish in a barrel. But steadily, the British developed methods and practices that not only reduced the loss of their ships, but also began making a serious dent in Germany's underwater fleet. Freighters began to travel in groups. They were accompanied by vessels specifically designed to combat submarines. Escort aircraft with improved radar and other targeting devices joined with the ships to begin sinking more and more of the marauding U-boats. In the last 4 months of 1941, 66 German submarines were permanently submerged. Just as the North Atlantic was becoming safer for Allied merchantmen, The United States entered the war and opened a window of opportunity for the Nazi subs. Prior to the commencement of hostilities between Germany and the U.S., ships traveling in the coastal waters of America did so without fear of attack. Once war was declared, these ships became fair game for the Wolfpacks. Despite the presence of only 5 Nazi subs, the final 2 weeks of 1941 saw 46 Allied merchantmen sunk off the east coast of America. Allied losses in the region continued to climb. In June, 121 freighters were sent to the bottom. It was at this point that the U.S. decided, perhaps somewhat belatedly, to institute interlocking convoys between the St. Lawrence and the Caribbean. With the freighters now protected at every point of their journey, American and British commanders might have felt justified in expecting a reduction in shipping losses. Now, however, the Nazis have begun churning out submarines at a phenomenal rate. By the end of 1942, the number of operational U-boats will, in all likelihood, be double what it was in January. As quickly as they are produced, they are manned by crews and dispatched to wreak havoc among the Allied convoys. Most of these crews are inexperienced and, as a result, probably doomed. They will, however, not go quietly. And so the game continues, with each player upping the ante, increasing the stakes. But while the engineers and politicians in Washington and Berlin are the ones who deal the cards, it is the men, and in cases such as the Laconia, the women and children, gambling their lives on the seas, who will continue to pay the price. October 1942, Stalingrad. As a beleaguered Red Army, plagued by shortages of weapons, food, and ammunition, struggles to hang on to a small strip of their city, in Washington, officials of the U.S. and USSR are signing an agreement designed to alleviate those deficiencies and bolster the Soviet war effort. Over the next 9 months, American Lend-Lease convoys will deliver nearly 4.5 million tons of supplies to a Soviet military machine starved for equipment and raw materials. The relief can't come too soon as far as Joseph Stalin and his commanders are concerned. In sweeping across Russia, the Nazis have captured factories, foundries, iron and coal mines, and power plants. Soviet output of war material has been reduced by more than 60%. Since the inception of Lend-Lease, Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Roosevelt have diverted shipments intended for Britain to the Russian port of Murmansk in the Arctic Ocean. But these stopgap deliveries have not been enough to sustain the Soviets over the long haul. With the signing of the agreement, the shipping of supplies can begin in earnest. Tons of equipment are loaded at ports in the U.S. and Britain, and the captains and crews prepare for what will probably be the most treacherous voyage they have ever taken. While maritime shipping during wartime has always been hazardous, these supply ships face an added element of danger. The German Navy has stationed destroyers, cruisers, U-boats, and battleships off the northern coast of Norway, putting them almost directly in the path of the Russian-bound fleets. With the Arctic sun shining 24 hours a day, the Nazi ships have had a devastating impact on convoys bound for Murmansk. In one instance, 23 of 34 freighters bound for the Russian port were sent to the bottom by the Germans. This had so shocked Churchill that he ordered a halt to shipments, but Roosevelt, while acknowledging the dangers, insists that they be resumed. The value of the Russian front in diluting Germany's military might is too great to be ignored. All of this has little meaning to the Russian men and women battling in the streets of Stalingrad. They know only that each day brings more fighting, more destruction, more death. Each time they seem to be holding the line, the Wehrmacht mounts yet another offensive. On 14 October, German General Friedrich von Paulus orders an attack in the northern sectors of the city. For von Paulus and his 6th Army, Stalingrad has been no cakewalk. It seems that each crumbling building has been turned into a small Russian fortress, which must be wrenched from the clutches of a resolute Red Army. This offensive is no different. Directly in the path of the attack is a huge tractor factory, which has been occupied and fortified by the Russians. Von Paulus orders 2 Panzer and 2 infantry divisions to clear the factory. The fighting is bloody and intense. It takes 4 days of fighting before the last Soviet soldier is killed and the factory taken. So even as the battle continues and the Germans advance, Von Paulus begins to suspect that he and his men may be moving into dire straits. His options are few, however. Pushed forward by a fanatical dictator with little taste for retreat and committed to the point where withdrawal is no longer an alternative, he must instead ask himself, having fought so hard to defeat so few, how he and his men can possibly overcome a whole army of Russians. October 1942, the Atlantic. Steaming from Britain and the United States, an armada larger and more powerful than any in history begins converging off the coast of North Africa. Made up of over 600 ships and carrying over 100,000 men, this fleet is the backbone of an amphibious operation known as Torch, which is intended to begin the rollback of Nazi troops throughout the African continent. Just as important, it is the first large-scale deployment of American troops against Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. While the Germans are certainly the primary foe facing the U.S. troops, Allied commanders led by Lieutenant General Dwight D. Eisenhower aren't certain whether their first contact will be with the Nazis or with the forces of the Vichy French. Though Rommel's Africa Corps controls much of Libya and western Egypt, the whole of northwest Africa is under the control of the French. The Vichy regime, which chose to cooperate with Hitler after the Nazi conquest of France itself, is technically neutral in Africa. But it is a neutrality without credibility to everyone outside of Berlin or the city of Vichy. Marshal Pétain, the World War I hero who made peace with the German invaders and the head of the Vichy state, is considered by the Allies to be, quite simply, a collaborator. The British, in particular, have reason to be wary of the French. Winston Churchill ascended to the prime ministry on the heels of Neville Chamberlain, who made the mistake of believing Hitler. Despite promises from Pétain and Hitler that French ships would not be co-opted into the service of the Reich, the Royal Navy commandeered and impounded the French fleet. The few French vessels that refused to submit to British boarding were sunk. That action has spurred a great deal of bitterness, not only in the Vichy regime, but among the Free French living in exile in London. Charles de Gaulle, who is totally dependent on the British, denounces the move, and French patriots in exile the world over complain that the British are no better than the Nazis. Hoping that the French will be less likely to open fire on American soldiers than British soldiers, the invasion, from top to bottom, is almost entirely an American operation. Eisenhower's preparations have been as much diplomatic as military. It is his hope that the French military in North Africa can be converted to the Allied cause. To that end, on 21 October, as the ships begin assembling off the African coast, he dispatches Major General Mark Clark to Algeria to conduct secret meetings with the French general, Charles Masse. Reporting to Eisenhower in Gibraltar, Clark says that Masse seemed duly impressed by the size of the arriving American force and gave assurances that, provided he was given 4 days' notice, troops under his command would offer no meaningful resistance to the Allied invasion. In addition, he agrees to accept the appointment of General Henri Giraud as Commander-in-Chief of French forces in North Africa. Meanwhile, as Allied ships continue to gather in the Atlantic, the American soldiers who are scheduled to go ashore are preparing for war. They go through drills, briefings, and inspections. Inevitably, in quiet moments, the young men find themselves housed in the unfamiliar confines of a troopship, as far from home as most of them have ever been, alone with their thoughts. With the exception of a few old-timers who served in the First World War, they are as yet untested in battle. Soon enough, they know, that will change, as these ships carry them, and with them America, into battle with Hitler and the Nazis.